There we go. Okay, welcome to this week's Small and Backyard Flock Community of Practice weekly or bi-weekly webinar. My name is Dr. Jackie Jacob, and I am with the University of Kentucky, and I'm also the coordinator for the Small and Backyard Flocks Community of Practice on e-extension. As part of my job, I organize these webinars. Currently, we're using a 20-minute webinar format, and we have them every other week on very specific topics. As you can see, we are recording the webinar, and the recording will be put up within a day or two. This week's talk is with Dr. Greg Martin from Penn State University, and he will be talking about housing requirements for small and backyard flocks. All yours, Greg.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jacobs. I want to thank all of you for coming in to watch this video. And it's a subject area that we do get a lot of questions about. And so we have put a lot of effort into trying to solve those questions because, quite frankly, I see a lot of offerings out there for housing and equipment that sometimes are not the best of a fit. And we'll talk a little bit about how that is important to think about when we're thinking about putting up housing for poultry. Okay, let's see if I can get this to go. I want to first acknowledge contributions from some of my teammates here at Penn State, Mr. Phil Clower, who has written a series of articles on this subject, as well as Dr. Patterson, who's a professor of poultry science at Penn State, and Dr. Ralph Ernst, who's a extension emeritus at University of California. So some of the things you need to think about when we're housing poultry is kind of what we call FLAWS. And that's an acronym that stands for feed, water, light, air, which is also what we call ventilation, and space. So if we have all those parameters in the right amounts and the right sizes, we're going to have a fairly decent chance of providing an optimal environment for our poultry to thrive in. So the other things that I added here too as well is freedom from predators. If we have poultry that is pastured or outside access to wildlife, that's an important thing to think about. And also something that happens on a more frequent basis that I see are poultry installations that people will have that get turned into their local townships or municipalities simply because they're breaking zoning laws. Either they have roosters that are crowing, peacocks that are sounding off, or something that is causing a disturbance to their neighbors. And so one of the things that you need to think about when you're considering housing poultry is it allowed in my particular part of the world? And so there might be caveats to it. For example, you may only keep hens, not roosters. You may have an age limit on the flock that you have, and so forth. So it's important to kind of go back through and talk with your local governance to see what is allowed as far as poultry, because poultry in certain areas are considered livestock. In certain areas of the country, they're considered pets. So it depends on what you're talking about. And lastly, it does take some money to properly equip a farm, and it may run a little bit higher than others, depending on the type and quality of especially the type of housing that you're buying and how it is made. Whether you make it yourself versus buying a pre-made house will make a difference in the amount of money you're going to spend on your project. So one of the things that you need to think about when you're housing poultry is the type of bird that you have. Housing for turkeys, for example, or ducks is much, much different than housing for laying hens that I'm showing here, or broilers. Broilers have a very finite lifetime from hatch to harvest, You may have them for 6 to 7 weeks, depending on how fast they're growing. With layers, you've got a 2 to 4 to 6 year commitment. And so your housing has to be able to withstand an all year, all round style of production. Whereas if you were just growing broilers for barbecuing and maybe for, freezer, you could raise in-season birds, which means during the spring and summer, and have minimal housing actually to raise these birds and fill your freezer before winter comes, where the requirements for housing would be dramatically more important. So when we think about equipment, we need to think about proper sizing. For example, the feeders that you see here, this is a trough type feeder here, is situated or sized for an adult bird, where all these here are either for baby chicks or for quail. In fact, this is a quail jar feeder. This is an open dish that is filled with marbles to keep quail from drowning in it. And then again, here's an egg carton that's cut down to accept feed for feeding baby chicks. So you need to have the proper size of equipment. You need to have, hopefully I can get it to go. You need to have heating from time to time, depending on where you are in the country and depending on what type of weather. We had 15-degree days, some of our days in this last month. We had snow this past month here in Pennsylvania. And so you need to have accommodations to handle inclement weather. You need to have, proper watering, both the volume and size, so that on a hot day, all your birds will be able to get to the water, and that the water is accessible and kept clean so that you're not cross-contaminating birds with anything. You need to have proper feeding space. It's usually you want an overabundance of feed space early on when the birds are just starting out. And that's why we usually see something like feeder trays here. And as they get older, then we move to more closed systems that help control spillage. And so feeding, an abundance of feeding is important early on, and then later on we back off into closed systems. Nest spaces for laying hens, of course, is important because you don't want floor eggs. You want to keep the eggs clean. And then roosting. Roosting is an important part, especially in what I would call tight housing, because what roosts allow us to do is increase the floor space without really increasing the footprint of the house, because you allow the birds to roost above the others that might be on the floor. So let's see here. There we go. So let's talk a little bit about feeders. Now, feeders can be made very easily. In fact, here's a good example I found online of just a plain wooden feeder that was made with lumber with a small spinner here that was just dowel rod that was nailed into the ends of the feeder trough here. Formal troughs can be also be made out of rain gutter. It can be made out of other things, that is, as long as it's wide enough for the hen or the bird to get their head into it. But the important thing to see here too is that this feeder actually shows the legs, and the legs are an important part of this because it needs to be adjusted properly. The spinner on the top keeps the birds from climbing into the feeder. And so a lot of feeders that we see here, like these tube type feeders, help eliminate birds from getting in. Now, even a feeder like this can have its problems simply because with the open top here, birds sometimes will jump in there, especially pullets. I see pullets all the time in the tops of tube feeders, but that can be controlled by the use of a cover. And there are covers that are sold with these types of feeders as well. You never want a feeder to be filled more than 1/3 to 2/3 full, and that's simply to keep the birds from billing the feeders out. I think I have a picture of that. Yeah, here we go. So when you're looking at the tube feeders here, you want to make sure that this feeder, for example, is properly filled, but it's much, much too low to the ground, and you can see that the birds are starting to bill the feed out, and that's a problem. The best way to have these is on a rope system with you can use a slip line knot that you can tie onto it to where you can just slide it up and down like a sash. Those work. And there's also rope bars that you can buy that actually pinches the rope as it goes up and down. You can easily adjust these feeders up and down. So you want the feeders to actually be at the back of the bird, or where the neck actually goes into the body of the chicken here. And that allows the bird to actually reach up and into the feeder, keeping them from spilling any of the feed onto the ground. You need to be careful with brooding feeders. I find a lot of times these that have guards on them sometimes will entrap small birds. So you need to be careful that they help train birds to eat very quickly, but you have to make sure you watch their feeding activity and move them onto a larger feeder as soon as they get a little bit bigger than the feeder can handle. What I'm starting to see now, especially in smaller flocks, is the use of these, what I call tornadoes. That's a brand name for it. But these are hopper type feeders that work very well. You can distribute these around a floor, as well as what we call feeder lids, which could be made out of just about anything you can think of. These are pressed plastic that work very well, that open up the surface area and the birds can get in and out and eat feed. There's less feed wastage, I think, with this type of feeder than these, but these are both effective in getting birds started. And it's important that if you're starting from day zero, that you have adequate food and water in your birds within the first 3 days. That's paramount to having a successful flock. Watering systems. It's important to have water for your birds. You need about, with adults, about 5 gallons of water for every 100 birds daily to have an adequate supply. And waterers need to be sized for your birds as well. This is a 1 gallon jug type waterer here that would be used for birds over a week of age and a little bit larger. Here's a 2 to 3 gallon font that is very portable. It has a handle here and you have a cap here that goes on the bottom. You fill it up with water, you invert it, you take it to the place where the birds are, and then you release the water out, and it self-levels into the lip here. These types of waterers do require a certain amount of maintenance. You need to wash these, probably dump them and wash them probably every other day or every 3 days, just because you have this lip here. And sometimes birds will regurgitate feed that's in their mouths, and this will get a slime or organic matter coating in here. So you need to brush that out with a toilet brush and clean it with good clean water. Fresh water is important. Water is the most important nutrient that we can feed chickens, and so it's important to keep fresh water in front of your birds. It's also a cooling device for the birds in hot weather. And I thought this was kind of an ingenious way of making what we call a closed system. The water actually stays enclosed in a container and drips out these nipples. The nipple has a valve in it, and so when the bird is pecking or pulling on the nipple, the water flows through and into the bird's mouth. It's really important to have nipple waterers adjusted so that they are above the eye of the bird, so that as the bird reaches up, it makes a direct line down the neck of the bird and into the bird. If a bird has to turn its head sideways in order to drink out of a nipple, it is too low. So it's important to make sure that nipple drinkers are always adjusted so that the birds are reaching for the nipples. Now, one of the neat things I've seen used in a small flock is a gravity-fed nipple line like this. So there was a bucket on the outside of the house that was connected to a hose, and then the hose ran into this. So the bucket acted as a regulator, a pressure regulator, to help reduce the pressure that was flowing into these nipples. And that's important because if you put too much pressure through the nipples, they'll cause them to leak. What he had filling the bucket automatically was a simple toilet valve that you can get at any home improvement store. So he drilled a hole in the bottom of the bucket, he installed this here, and then he had a garden hose come up with pressured water. The pressured water would come out of this valve and would fill the bucket until the valve shut off with this float. And so this bucket was always being refilled with water. And this was great because if he was leaving on a hot summer day, he knew that he had a continuous flow of water into the house without flooding the house with too much water. So that's a handy way of creating a closed system. It's important to note that, yeah, some of these buckets actually have a lid, and if I had a system like this, I certainly would put a lid on the bucket to keep it to keep the water closed, as you see here in this system here. So the keys to a good chicken coop, to me, the appearance really doesn't make much difference to me as long as the functionality is there. You need to make sure that you can control temperature. You need to be able to block drafts and to control moisture. You need to make sure that it's constructed and so that there's no sharp projections, there's no nail points out there, or anything that could injure a hen. And it needs to be impervious to predators. The chicken wire, for example, in some of these pens actually goes down into the ground to keep varmints from digging, like raccoons digging into the pens and going after the chicks. You need to provide appropriate space. The general rule of thumb is 2 square foot per bird for the inside portions of these houses. Out in the yards, a yard system here, you should allow about 5 to 10 square feet per bird out in the yards, so that you have adequate space for the birds and you're not causing any type of behavioral difficulties with pecking and other things that happen when you confine birds too closely. You need to make sure you provide clean access to feed and water and good ventilation. The ventilation actually works to help keep the moisture levels down by helping dry off the litter. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how to orient these things a little bit here to keep those houses a little bit drier. The house should be constructed so that it's easy to clean. And that's an important thing. If you can't get into the house to clean it, if you at least get into it or at least stand it up or whatever to get in and clean it out, then that's going to be harder to maintain that house. These houses are great. They're what we call sunshine brooders, but they're actually too small for somebody to get into unless you have a removable roof or something that you can actually lift up and get in to clean out some of these houses here. Because if they get full of manure, they're not going to be useful. So they need to be easy to clean. They need to provide appropriate light, either through windows or from lighting systems. And they should be kept up to the point where they don't look shabby. So they can have some age to them, but a board on a board or a tin can over a hole or something like that, that doesn't always look the best. And appearances are important because every now and then you're going to have visitors to the farm or to your backyard, and they want to see, they have an impression that poultry keepers keep appropriate, well-organized housing. So here's some of the housing that I've seen in my travels. This is me actually next to a pastured house that was mobile. And so he had feeders and waterers inside this hoop type structure with ramps that went down into the pasture. And so they would go out and feed and move in the pasture during the day. And then at night they would coop up and they would stay in the hoop structure here overnight. This is a cattle panel hoop house that has, you can get the plans from the University of Kentucky, and there's the link to that. The reason why I like these houses is that they're highly portable, they're easy to build, the materials are relatively available, and you can use this for both layers as well as meat type birds, as well as turkeys if you made it big enough. If for a turkey house, I probably would even double the size of this house. Now there are housing styles that are available for purchase elsewhere by others. But when you're looking at these things, always look at the idea of the things that I've talked about as far as access and the ability to protect your birds in the weather that you find yourselves in. For example, a hoop type house like this may not work very well in high wind or in areas that are extremely cold. This house here might work better in a cold climate, but as you can see, the doors are very, very small in order to get into it. There is a manure drawer here that you can pull out probably to change out the manure, but if you needed to get in there to grab a bird that might be sick or injured, and that's going to be a tight fit. The other thing too is that if you're building a house with nest boxes that are exposed to the outside here, those need to be made so that you can open up no more than 2 boxes at a time, 2 nest boxes at a time. I've seen 4-foot doors on the backs of these houses, and when you were collecting eggs in this corner, chickens were jumping out on the other side of the box, and the race was on to catch them. So you want to open only a few boxes at a time so that you can access the eggs without losing your birds, and that's an important thing. Shed type housing. Shed type housing, I think, is probably the most predominant type of housing that I see. With a shed type roof, it's just a simple angle design. What this allows you to do is to position the house so that the smallest exposure is into the predominant wind direction. So if I was getting wind from the northwest of my property, I would position this exposure to the northwest so that it almost acts as a wind foil and blocks the wind. On the converse side, this is pointing then to the southeast, and the southern exposure would actually help warm the majority of the house with sunshine even in the middle of winter. I would have windows on this side of the house big enough to where if I had to, I could open the windows and open these windows and have airflow going through the house. And then what you don't see on the back side is that I would have chicken doors that would open up that are small enough to allow birds to go through but not lose too much heat. And so this is a gable style roof, the same idea, but at least you could position these as well to put the smallest exposure towards the prevailing wind. And that'll keep the house a lot warmer in wintertime. Perches and nest boxes. These are important things for laying hens. What perches allow you to do is that you allow yourself to put more birds in a floor area without them impacting each other. Because when they're up off the ground, that allows the other birds to run around. And so the general rule of thumb is to use 2x2 pieces of wood, 12 inches apart, so that the birds can be spaced out, and at least 18 inches off the floor. So this rung here, I probably would remove, and that way we would have 18 inches so that birds can run in and out, up against the wall, and so forth. The angle of attack here is about 45 degrees, and you need to allow about 6 inches of lineal space of perch here per bird that you're making allowances for. With nest boxes, you start off with 2 boxes for 4 birds, and then for every the next 4 birds, you're going to add a nest. So usually the rule of thumb is 4 birds per nest, starting with 2 and working your way up. These are 2 good examples of what I see as far as nest boxes. I've seen them with folding perches where they fold up to block the entrance to the nest box. Some people like the fact that they're going to be in and out all the time, but you do have to remember that sometimes birds will get broody, which means they'll sit on the nest and they refuse to lay eggs. And so it's important to make sure that you have adequate space there to allow birds access. The other thing that's important is when you're making nest boxes is to have a front to them. Like you see here, there's the top of a bucket lid that makes this half moon shape here that allows the nesting material to stay in the nest. Same thing here. There's that front material there. I've seen open nest boxes where all the litter is just being pushed out of the nest all the time by the hen trying to build a nest cup. So you need to have a front to these nest boxes in order for them to be effective. Light is an important factor. If you want to have if you want eggs all year round, you need to make sure you supplement the light that they see so that they never see a decrease in the duration of light that they experience during the day. And here's a series of different types of timers. Most of you have access to these. This is actually an outdoor type timer. These are indoor timers that I've seen used in poultry housing before as well. There is LED lighting, for example, that have the right color. You need to make sure you have a full spectrum LED so that they get the entire wavelength of light that they need for egg production. This one actually has a reflector that pushes light down. A general rule is to have a 25-watt bulb covering 100 square foot of interior space that you're trying to light. It's enough light to at least give you half a foot candle of light, enough light to read a newspaper in dim light. And that's all that's really needed for egg production. If you overdo the lights, sometimes you will get cannibalism, and so it's important not to overdo lighting. A lot of times in certain areas, your yard lights, your overnight security lights is enough light to keep your hens in production. Some folks really don't care. They like seasonal egg production anyway, and so when the winter comes, the hens go broody, and they take a pause during the winter time. With heating lamps, which is important for the start of life, you want to get a heating lamp that actually has a thermostatic control here. That's a controller unit here that has a wafer, and the wafer helps control the lights, and that way you're not overheating your house. And the brooder lamp should be always hung by either a cable or a chain, something that is ferrous so it doesn't overheat and drop into the shavings. That's a very important part of this, is that it needs to be properly hung with the right hanging material. So a chain or a cable is a requirement. This is important because if you're brooding correctly, you're actually putting a space here where there's warmth, and the birds will actually move in and out of the warm spot as it's necessary. And then you're going to put feeders and waterers around the area to give them adequate feeder and water space. So that's important when we're setting up the brooder. And when you're looking at it over here, if you have the hover here and you see the birds starting to clump or move, it's showing that your housing is actually drafty. If it is all clumped together underneath the hover and there's barely enough room there, then you're going to see that it's too cold. Too hot, all the birds are against the chick ring, same idea. So you can tell pretty much by the temperature what's going on with the birds just by behavior. And of course, just right is when they're evenly distributed through the room. Some other things to consider, especially when you're in areas like Florida and Georgia and other places where it gets really, really hot, you need to make sure you have adequate shade for the birds, especially if they're out in pasture situations. Hiding spots are important for pastured birds as well. Putting lean-tos, for example, of plywood or something like that allows the birds to get under them if they see raptors out there, hawks, sparrowhawks, other things. And if they're out all night, there could be owls going out after them. If you want, you can also hang grit boxes out there with oyster shell or granite grit for extra calcium to be fed free choice to the birds. I've seen those being used as well. You need to have proper feed storage. Feed storage needs to be in a cool, dry place away from the sun. And the reason for that is that when feed gets too hot, you deactivate all your vitamins and you lose its potency. So that's important to have proper feed storage. Garbage cans, as well as garden sheds, as well as other things that you can store food into. That would be the perfect way of keeping your feed fresh and available for your birds. And then lastly, when we have livestock, we need to think that we may have the case of dead stock. And so you need to have a mortality plan for what you would do if your birds died. And so some people compost their mortality, others double bag and use the municipal garbage system to do that. Those are usually approved uses. Make sure you check into it to see if it's possible to do that. So going back to the fundamentals, it's always important to remember the flaws of your situation to make sure you have adequate feed, adequate light, adequate air moving through the house so that you don't have stale air or too hot or too cold of a condition. To make sure you have plenty of water, to make sure you have plenty of space, both feeder space, water space, and floor space, as well as perch space, and to make sure that you're set up to have a biosecure place. Make sure you have something like a chair so that you can change your boots from the pen boots to your walking shoes, or at least maybe a decontamination station there to where you can wash your boots to make sure that whatever you're bringing from the outside is not getting into the inside of your poultry pens. And with that, I think I'm going to stop here and answer questions that you may have. If not, have a great day.
Thanks, Greg. We're a little over time, but so far I haven't seen any questions. If you had a question, you could type it in the Q&A box, or you can simply type it in the chat box. I'll give you 1 minute. If I don't see any questions, then we will sign off for the day.
Rhonda, I see Rhonda has signed in. Rhonda, can you give us an idea of where you're from, what state? You can type it into the chat box.
Maybe she's shy. Oh, Virginia.
Virginia, perfect.
Nice and cold there too.
Yes. Well, it won't be always, but the important thing to note is that whenever we have housing, we need to make sure it will handle the extremes that we have in our particular area, so that, if it's in Virginia and you're going to have an 80-degree day with 80% humidity, you need to be able to ventilate properly so that you're not creating a hot box. And I've seen a lot of people use housing that may work in Maine, but it doesn't work in Virginia because it gets too hot. And I've seen pretty big disasters where the chickens got too hot and they died of heat stroke. So make sure you have adequate space to allow for good ventilation and cooling when it's too hot, and allow you to button it up when it gets too cold. Because, of course, I've seen ice chunks in Nebraska there on the sides of the banks of the river there. Yeah.
Donna has a question in regards to the outside water supply. Is there a danger of the black pipe being heated in the sunlight?
Yes. Yes, it can. So if you go to your home improvement stores, there's actually cellulose insulation that you can put over the black pipe to keep it that way. The other thing you can do is actually bury the pipe in the ground. That's what most plumbers do, and that helps insulate the pipe as well. Sometimes, especially with mobile units, you're moving water around by hose. You can use that cellulose insulation to put over the hose to help block the sun from hitting it that way. And if you can't find it in the store, go to the sports store and buy pool noodles. Those noodles that kids play with, you can split those and put them around the hose as well, and that'll block the sun from hitting the hose.
That's a good idea.
And use green hose, not black hose, because black is a color that absorbs heat.
Yeah. Just bring it on.
Yeah.
Okay, Donna says thanks. I think we'll end it here. We went a little over time, Not a problem. A lot of good information. So thank you for coming. I hope you will attend the webinar that we are going to have in 2 weeks' time, which is an overview of poultry equipment for backyard flocks, maybe build on some of the stuff that Greg talked about. And we do have a special webinar on Friday for an hour on producing and using black soldier fly larvae as a food source in small and backyard flocks with Dr. Fanatico out of Appalachia State University. So that was a special one that can cover all people involved in poultry production, not just the backyard guys. So thank you all for attending. As we said, this is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Learn page shortly. And thank you for coming, and I hope to see you again. Thanks, Greg.
You betcha.